The cabin was quiet. 37,000 feet. Smooth air. Soft lighting overhead. The kind of silence that costs money to be inside of. Then she walked up. Slow. Measured. Clipboard in hand. "Sir." Her voice didn't rise. Didn't shake. It landed flat and clean, like something rehearsed in front of a mirror. "We've received multiple reports indicating inappropriate contact toward another passenger." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Khyven Doss sat completely still. Dark glasses resting across the bridge of his nose. White cane leaning against the armrest. His hands were open, relaxed, flat against his thighs. He didn't jerk. Didn't flinch. Didn't turn his head fast the way most people do when they're blindsided. He turned it slow, deliberate, like he was listening to something the rest of the cabin couldn't hear. "Multiple," he said. "Not a question. Not an accusation. Just the word. Hanging in the pressurized air like smoke." The flight attendant. Her name tag read Brianna. Adjusted her posture slightly. Just slightly. 1 degree of shift in the shoulders. A micro-movement most people in that cabin missed entirely. Khyven didn't miss it. He couldn't see her. But he heard it. The way her next breath came a half-second later than it should have. The accusation had landed clean. Too clean. No noise before it. No argument. No build-up. No raised voices from rows away. Nothing that would typically precede a formal complaint at altitude. Just a woman in a pressed uniform walking up the aisle with a clipboard and a rehearsed sentence. Clean accusations are dangerous. They're usually designed. Hi viewers, have you ever been accused of something you didn't do, and the people around you just believed it without asking a single question? Drop your answer in the comments. A few rows back, 2 passengers whispered. One man in a gray cardigan shifted in his seat and looked away from Khyven like eye contact had suddenly become expensive. A woman near the window pulled her cardigan tighter and glanced at the couple across the aisle to measure their reaction before forming her own. That's how it starts. Not with certainty, with suggestion. 3 rows behind Khyven, a boy sat straight in his seat. 9 years old. Dark brown suit, sharp collar, blue tie knotted precisely at the throat. His name was Zaire Hale. And he wasn't watching Brianna. He was watching everyone else. His eyes moved the way a camera moves when you know what you're filming. Not random, targeted, passenger to passenger. Tracking the micro-behaviors, the timing of reactions. Who looked too fast, who didn't look at all, who was already deciding before the story was finished. He didn't say anything. Not yet. Beside him, his father leaned forward slightly in the aisle seat. Baron Hale, CEO of Hale Consolidated. A man who had spent 23 years learning how to make problems quiet before they became expensive. "This can be resolved," Baron said. His voice was low. Meant for Brianna. Meant for the row around him. Discreetly, Zaire turned and looked at his father. The look lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked back at Khyven, because Khyven had just opened his mouth. "What time?" Khyven said, his voice calm and unhurried. "Did this happen?" Brianna's grip on the clipboard tightened. The knuckles didn't go white, but the pressure changed. Zaire saw it. She pulled a breath. "Approximately 10 minutes ago." Approximately. That word. Zaire's jaw shifted slightly. His eyes stayed forward. Approximately is not a time. Approximately is what people say when they didn't actually check. When the story was handed to them and they filled in the blanks the best they could. A formal complaint. A structured statement. Multiple reports. And the best she had on timing was approximately. The first crack was there. Right there. Khyven tilted his head slightly to the left. That same slow, deliberate turn. Like he was storing the sound of her hesitation somewhere deep behind those dark glasses. And then, so faint that Zaire almost questioned whether he imagined it. Khyven smiled. Not wide. Not warm. Not the kind of smile that reassures people. The kind that means something already clicked. Zaire turned back to the cabin. Measured. Quiet. Already running the numbers in his head. Then something caught him. One passenger. Aisle seat. Row 4. First class section, forward of the curtain. A man in a charcoal blazer who had not once looked up from his phone since the moment Brianna made the accusation. Not once. Everyone else had looked. Instinct. Human wiring. When a public accusation drops in a small space, you look. You assess. You react. This man did not. He tapped at his screen. Calmly. Precisely. Like he already knew the outcome. Zaire stared at the back of that man's seat for a long moment. Then he leaned slowly toward his father and said 4 words. This started before takeoff. Veron didn't respond immediately. That was one of his habits. The pause before words. The corporate silence that men like him used to project control. He had perfected it over 2 decades of boardrooms and bad news and billion-dollar negotiations where the first person to speak usually lost. But his son wasn't in a boardroom. And the pause meant nothing to him. Zaire had already moved on. His eyes returned to the cabin. Systematic. Unhurried. He wasn't looking at Khyven anymore. Khyven was the surface. The visible part. What mattered now was the architecture underneath. The structure supporting the accusation. Because accusations at altitude, formal ones, documented ones, multiple reports ones, don't appear without something holding them up. Somebody built this. The question was who? Brianna was still standing near Khyven's row. She had a second crew member hovering 2 steps behind her now. Older woman. Shorter. Name tag too small to read from this distance. But her body language was unmistakable. Arms crossed low. Weight back. She wasn't there to support Brianna. She was there to observe her. Zaire logged that. A supervisor watching from behind isn't backup. It's oversight. Which means somewhere in the crew chain, there was uncertainty about whether Brianna had handled this correctly. And if the crew itself wasn't fully behind this report, then who was? He let his eyes drift forward again. Row 4. The man in the charcoal blazer still hadn't looked up. Zaire studied him without turning his head fully. Peripheral. The man's phone screen was angled slightly downward, which meant he wasn't watching video. He wasn't scrolling social. The tapping pattern was short and deliberate, sending something, or waiting for a response. In the middle of a developing incident on a flight at altitude. Who sends messages during this? Not a bored passenger. Not someone genuinely unbothered. Someone managing something. Zaire filed it. Didn't move. Back near Khyven's row, 2 passengers had started a quiet exchange. He could see it from the shoulders, the lean toward each other, the head angled down, the hand partially over the mouth. The kind of conversation people have when they want to process something without being heard making a judgment. But judgment was already forming. That's what accusation does in a compressed public space. It doesn't need evidence. It needs time and silence. Leave something uncontested long enough and the human brain fills in the narrative. Not because people are cruel, because they're wired for pattern. And the pattern Brianna had laid out, calm, official, formal, fit the shape of authority. An authority most people trust. That's the design flaw in all of this. People believe the format before they evaluate the content. Across the aisle from Khyven, a middle-aged woman had visibly moved her bag. Just a shift, an inch, but she'd moved it further from Khyven's seat. Not angry, not dramatic, just away. Like proximity had become a liability. Zaire watched that happen. It matters. It matters because that woman didn't receive any new information. No witness came forward. No detail was added. Brianna's statement sat there unchanged. And still, the woman moved the bag. Which means the accusation alone had already done damage. Already begun rewriting the social geometry of the cabin. Kyvan Doss, at this exact moment, was more isolated than he had been 4 minutes ago. And he hadn't done a single thing wrong. Veron shifted in his seat and lowered his voice. Zaire, this isn't the place. Zaire didn't look at him. It's the only place. These situations are handled through proper. She said multiple reports. Zaire's voice stayed even. We're on a flight. Who filed multiple reports? When? To whom? Through what channel? Veron opened his mouth. Closed it. Because he didn't have the answer. And more uncomfortably, he hadn't asked the question. Zaire finally turned and looked at his father directly. You were going to let it go quiet. Veron held his son's gaze. The discomfort there wasn't anger. It was something rarer in men like him. Recognition. I was going to handle it appropriately, Veron said carefully. Handle what? Which part? The accusation or the man in row for who hasn't looked up once? That landed. Veron's eyes cut forward to row 4, for the first time since the confrontation began. He looked at the back of the charcoal blazer. The phone. The deliberate stillness. Who is he? Veron asked. That's what I need you to find out. Veron studied the man for a moment. Then, slowly, he pulled out his own phone. Zaire turned back to the cabin. Up ahead, Kyvan had gone very still again. That particular stillness that wasn't passive. He was processing, sorting, the same way Zaire was sorting, just through different instruments. No vision, pure audio, the shift in cabin energy, the direction of whispers, the frequency of movement near him. Kyvan Doss was reading this room the same way a sonar reads water. Invisible signals bouncing back with information about the shape of the world. He was not afraid. That was the second thing Zaire had noted about him at the very start. Most people, hit with a public accusation in a sealed metal tube at altitude, go one of two ways. Loud, or collapsed. Kyvan had gone neither. He sat the way a man sits when he already knows what's being done to him and has decided the first move isn't his to make. That level of composure doesn't come from innocence alone. It comes from understanding. Zaire straightened in his seat. Brianna was speaking again, quietly to the supervisor. He couldn't catch the words, but the supervisor's expression shifted, barely, toward something that looked like concern. Not about Kyvan. About Brianna's account. Zaire caught the edge of it. He leaned slightly toward his father again. Get me the cabin logs, he said. Full crew movement. Service timeline. Everything from boarding to right now. Veron looked at him. I don't have authority over. You own 7% of this airline's parent company. Zaire didn't say it loudly. He said it simply. The way you state a fact that isn't up for debate. Make the call. A long pause. Then Veron reached back into his pocket. And in row 4, for the first time since the accusation was made, the man in the charcoal blazer looked up. Not at Kyvan. Zaire. Kyvan didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand. Didn't gesture. Didn't call for anyone's attention. He simply spoke. Who filed the first report? The question was directed at Brianna. But the cabin heard it. And the cabin felt it, the way you feel a temperature drop without seeing it happen. A quiet shift. Nothing dramatic. Just colder. Brianna reset her posture. As I indicated, there were multiple. I'm not asking how many. Kyvan's voice was still level. Still quiet. Like still water over sharp rock. I'm asking who. First report. One person. Who was it? She didn't answer immediately. And that gap, that small 4-second space where the answer should have been, said more than the answer would have. Zaire was watching her from his row. Watching the way Brianna's eyes moved slightly to the left. Not at another passenger. Not at the supervisor behind her. Just left. The direction people look when they're building a sentence instead of remembering one. This matters. When you remember something, the eyes typically go up or straight. When you're constructing something, when you're filling in a story with words that fit, they go left. Not always, but often enough. Kaivan couldn't see any of this, but he heard the delay. We document reports collectively, Brianna said finally, for passenger privacy. At what point during the flight was the report documented? Another pause. Shorter this time, but still there. I don't have the exact. Approximately, Kaivan said. He said it the same way he'd said multiple. Just the word. No edge to it. No mockery. Clean as a blade. Someone 3 rows behind Zaire coughed. Quietly. The kind of cough people release when they're feeling something they don't want to feel in public. Brianna's right hand shifted against the clipboard. The reports were escalated to me approximately 10 minutes ago, Kaivan said. Like the incident itself. Brianna stopped. Zaire watched her jaw adjust. A small movement, like something had tightened in her throat. Because Kaivan had just done something Brianna likely didn't anticipate. He had reflected her own language back at her, word for word. And in doing so, he'd made visible what that language actually sounded like. Approximate. Again, the report was approximately escalated. The incident happened approximately 10 minutes ago. The whole constructed timeline was balanced on that single imprecise word. And Kaivan had let it stand there so everyone could see the weight it couldn't hold. Truth doesn't shout. It destabilizes. Veron shifted beside Zaire. He was watching the exchange now. Not with the boardroom control he usually carried. With something quieter. Tension. Real attention, the kind that means you're no longer managing the situation, you're inside it. He's precise, Veron said. Zaire didn't reply. He was watching the cabin. The passengers who had already made up their minds, you could see them. Tight posture. Closed faces. Arms folded low. They decided the moment Brianna made the statement. And Kaivan's composure didn't reassure them. It unsettled them. Because the story they'd accepted required Kaivan to be reactive. Emotional. Guilty looking. His stillness didn't fit that story. And when people can't fit new information into an existing belief, they don't update the belief. They distrust the new information. But there were others. Closer to the aisle. A younger man in a window seat who had started to lean slightly forward. A woman across the row who had stopped looking at Brianna and started watching Kaivan. Small adjustments. The kind that signal a mind beginning to reconsider. The cabin was splitting. Slowly. Quietly. Right down the middle. Kaivan asked his next question. Where were you standing when the incident occurred? Brianna's answer came faster this time, almost too fast. I was in the aisle, near rows 12 through 14. Which side? Port side. The whole time. She hesitated. I moved through the section as part of my service route. Kaivan nodded once. Slowly. Like he was cataloging the answer somewhere behind those dark glasses and moving it to a specific shelf. Standard service interval at this point in the flight would put you where? The galley? Brianna didn't answer. The supervisor behind her took one very small step forward. Almost involuntary, like her body reacted before her mind could stop it. Zaire caught it. He pulled out the slim tablet from the seat pocket in front of him. Opened the notes application. Typed quickly. Attendant places herself in aisle during incident. Standard service interval contradicts. Supervisor stepped forward on galley question. He closed the notes app and set the tablet face down on his knee. Up ahead, Kaivan had paused. He was letting the silence work for him. Letting the unanswered question stay in the air where the whole cabin could feel it. Not demanding a response. Not pressing. Just waiting the way you wait for a building to show you where it leans. I was transitioning between positions, Brianna finally said. Her voice had dropped a fraction. During service. Transitioning. Another soft word. Zaire kept his expression neutral. But internally, the word slotted into a pattern he was building piece by piece. She hadn't said she saw anything. She'd said she received reports. She'd said the incident happened 10 minutes ago. She'd said she was in the aisle during service. But she'd never once said the words, "I witnessed this," because she hadn't. She was repeating a story she'd been given, filling in the geography with service speak and procedure language. And Khyven, without being able to see a single face in the cabin, had walked her right to the edge of that fact and left her standing on it. Zaire looked forward. Row 4. The man in the charcoal blazer had put his phone face down on his tray table. First time in 12 minutes. His eyes were forward now. Not at Khyven. Not at Brianna. Straight ahead. The fixed gaze of someone who is recalibrating. Something in the exchange had shifted his calculation. Zaire noted the time on his watch. Then Khyven smiled again. That same faint edge of an expression. Unhurried. Knowing. He already knew something was broken in the story. And he was walking through it like a man who could see perfectly fine. The logs came through on Veyron's phone 11 minutes after he made the call. He passed the device to Zaire without a word. Zaire scrolled through them carefully. Not fast. He moved the way surgeons move, with intention, no wasted motion. The cabin log was a time-stamped record. Seatbelt sign cycles. Altitude changes. Galley activity. Meal service initiation and close. Crew station positions during each service interval. He found the window he was looking for. The time of the alleged incident. Approximately 10 minutes before Brianna approached Khyven. Corresponded to a service interval logged as galley prep. Coffee cart loading. Inventory count. 2 crew members listed at that galley position during the window. One of those crew members was listed as B. Walker. Brianna Walker. She had been in the galley. Not in the aisle. Not near rows 12 through 14. Not within visual range of the seat Khyven occupied. She had been in the galley. Zaire set the phone face down against his knee and sat very still for a moment. This wasn't a minor error. This wasn't misremembered placement. The log was time-stamped, automatic, system-generated, not subject to recollection or selective memory. And it placed Brianna in a location that made it physically impossible for her to have witnessed anything, because she was behind a closed galley partition a full 6 rows away. She had reported something she couldn't have seen, which meant someone told her what to report. People don't lie perfectly. Systems do. Zaire looked up from the phone and ran the pattern through again, because he wanted to be certain before he moved. His father always said that the difference between being effective and being reckless was the discipline to verify what you already suspected before acting on it. So he verified. Timeline of the accusation. Brianna approached Khyven within minutes of alleged incident. Clean, formal, structured statement. Multiple reports. Clipboard in hand. No agitation. No personal anger. Just procedure. Procedure takes preparation. You don't pick up a clipboard and deliver a multi-report statement against a passenger without being briefed. Without having language prepared. Without having the shape of the complaint already in hand. Someone had briefed her. Crew movement in the log prior to the accusation. Brianna had exited the galley 2 minutes and 14 seconds before approaching Khyven. Less than 1 service cycle. Not enough time to receive and independently verify multiple reports. Barely enough time to receive 1 summary statement from another person. Who gave her that statement? Zaire moved his eyes forward. Row 4. The man in the charcoal blazer had still not picked up his phone. He was sitting with his hands folded on the tray table now. The posture of a man who has decided to look neutral. Deliberately neutral. The kind of neutral that requires effort. Zaire turned slightly in his seat and looked at his father. Who is he? Zaire asked. Row 4. Charcoal jacket. Veyron had already been working on it. He kept his voice at barely a murmur. Terence Wole, frequent traveler. filed 4 airline-related complaints in the last 18 months, all on this carrier. 3 resulted in out-of-court settlements. Zaire looked at him. Veron continued. 2 of them involved accusations made mid-flight. 1 was dropped before legal proceedings. The other 2, Veron paused, chose the word carefully. Resolved. Resolved at whose expense? Veron was quiet for a moment. The airlines. Zaire turned back forward. There it was. Not personal. Not some conflict between Kaivan and another passenger. Not a misunderstanding that escalated. This was operational. Terence Wole operated a pattern. Create conditions mid-flight. Involve crew. Generate documentation. Let the airline's legal liability mechanism do the rest. Airlines settle because the cost of litigation at altitude, the reputational risk, the PR complexity, the discovery process, is almost always higher than a quiet payout. And to trigger that mechanism, you needed one thing. Complaint on record. Multiple reports. He had gotten to Brianna somehow. Before the flight or early in it. She was new. Zaire had already clocked it from the way the supervisor watched her. Knew enough to believe that what she was being asked to do was right. Knew enough to trust the framing. Knew enough to carry the clipboard without questioning why she was carrying it. She wasn't malicious. She was used. That distinction mattered. But it didn't change what had happened. Zaire picked up his tablet again. He opened the Notes app. Typed a single line. Wole pre-filed. Brianna was positioned. No witness exists. Logs confirm galley position contradicts placement claim. He closed it. Then something else pulled his attention. Brianna had moved. Not toward Kaivan. She had stepped back slightly and was now standing at the edge of the aisle near row 10. Her supervisor, the older woman, was speaking to her in a low and steady voice. And Brianna's posture had changed. The clipboard was at her side now. Her chin was down slightly. Her shoulders had a tension in them that hadn't been there before. She was being questioned. Not by Kaivan. Not by... The system was beginning to question itself. Zaire watched Brianna's face during the exchange. Even from rows back, he could see the way the certainty in her expression had shifted into something more uncomfortable, more uncertain, like she was being asked to locate the foundation of the story she'd been standing on and was just beginning to realize she couldn't find it. He didn't feel satisfaction. He felt the weight of what was coming. Because what happens next to a person who delivered an accusation they believed in, who had no idea they were the instrument of someone else's scheme, is not simple. That mattered too. But it didn't change what he needed to do. He turned to his father one more time. Row 4, Zaire said quietly. I need you to have him identified to the cabin supervisor. Not confronted. Identified. Get his pre-flight documentation pulled if this airline has the authorization. Veron looked at his son. A long look. The kind that goes past the surface. Zaire. Dad. A pause. Not impatient. Just clear. She was in the galley. Veron looked at the phone. At the log. At the timestamp sitting there undeniable and automatic and completely indifferent to what everyone thought happened. Then he made the second call. And in row 4, without being spoken to, without any visible signal, Terence Wole slowly reached for his phone. And turned it face down. Veron's contact on the airline side was a man named Darius Okafor. Senior Operations Liaison. Not crew. Not security. The kind of position that existed to quietly manage the gap between what happened on a flight and what ended up in a report. Veron had known him for 6 years through overlapping board interests and a compliance conference in Atlanta that neither of them wanted to attend. Darius answered in 2 rings. Veron kept the conversation short, factual, controlled. He told Darius there was a documentation concern, that cabin logs contradicted crew placement on a formal passenger complaint, that they needed crew movement records officially pulled and a senior flight authority notified. Then he mentioned the name Terence Wole. Silence on the other end. Not long. 3 seconds. But meaningful. I'll make the call, Darius said. Veron ended it. He looked at Zaire. He knew the name. Zaire had expected that. How quickly? 10 minutes. Maybe less. Zaire nodded once and looked back to the front of the cabin. Brianna and her supervisor had moved slightly further down the aisle. The conversation between them had extended. The supervisor was now holding Brianna's clipboard, had taken it at some point during the exchange, and was looking at something on it. Her expression wasn't angry. It was focused. The kind of focus that means you're looking for something you're not sure is there. The kind that means you suspect it isn't. Khyven had not moved. He sat the way he had sat since the beginning, upright, cane resting against the armrest, hands in his lap, the dark glasses steady forward. He was not performing patience. He simply had it, the kind that doesn't burn energy on things that haven't happened yet. Zaire studied him. Most people under that kind of public pressure leak. Not always with panic. Sometimes with subtle performance, the small overcorrections that signal awareness of being watched. The too still posture, the too neutral face. Khyven had none of that. He was present in the way that a room is present. No announcement, no performance, just there. He was either extremely trained in emotional regulation, or he had been through something like this before. Zaire wasn't sure which was more significant. A flight attendant, different from Brianna, male older, moved up the aisle carrying 2 drinks and stopped 2 rows past Khyven's seat. He handed the drinks across, made eye contact with the recipients, smiled, moved on. A completely normal service interaction. But Zaire noticed the route. He'd gone around Khyven's row. Not obviously. Not with hostility. He'd angled just enough to avoid the row entirely without acknowledgement. And the passengers he'd served, they'd accepted the drinks without looking at Khyven either. Invisible pressure. No one ordered it. No one planned it. It emerged from the accusation the way heat emerges from a confined space. The cabin had decided, not loudly, not consciously, that row 17 was where the problem sat. And until the problem was resolved, the behavior around it adjusted accordingly. That's the real cost. Not the legal exposure. Not the formal documentation. The immediate ambient social consequence. The isolation that settles around a person before a single fact has been established. Before one witness steps forward. Before one document is reviewed. Just the accusation. Already enough. Zaire turned forward. The logs were still open on his father's phone. He picked it up again and went back through the timestamps carefully. Not looking at Brianna's position this time. Looking at the larger picture. There was a notation he'd moved past the first time. Pre-boarding passenger document. Row 4. Premium cabin. Submitted a pre-flight cabin comfort request through the airline's customer relations channel. Standard procedure for premium passengers. But the request had been submitted 47 minutes before boarding closed. Specific in its language. Mentioned sensitivity to disturbance. Mentioned preference for formal documentation if any cabin incident occurred. Zaire read that line twice. Preference for formal documentation if any cabin incident occurred. You don't write that in a comfort request unless you're expecting an incident, or planning one. He put the phone down. Closed his eyes for exactly 4 seconds. A habit, not rest. Reset. Then opened them. Veron was watching him. What are you thinking? He set it up before he boarded, Zaire said. The request creates a paper trail that makes him look like a concerned passenger. If an incident gets reported, he has prior documentation showing he flagged sensitivity to cabin disturbance. It makes him look like a victim adjacent to the situation. Adds legitimacy to any complaint he reinforces. Veron went very still. And Brianna, Zaire continued, Received instruction from someone in the cabin. Or before the flight. New crew members are briefed by senior crew at gate. If someone in that chain had contact with Wole's operation, he didn't finish. Didn't need to. The mechanics were visible now. Not perfectly. Not with every detail filled in. But enough. A passenger with a history of mid-flight litigation. A pre-submitted document creating anticipatory legitimacy. A new crew member positioned as the formal face of the complaint. A structured accusation delivered without witnesses. A blind passenger selected, likely not by accident, because the optics of his disability would complicate any pushback without an explicit witness. Real power isn't loud. It's access. The intercom above crackled once. Short. The kind of short that means communication between crew stations, not passenger announcement. Zaire watched the supervisor straighten when it came through, watched her turn and look forward at the cockpit area. Darius had made his call. Something was shifting in the official structure of the flight. Zaire folded his hands in his lap, then looked at Kaivan's row again. He had a direct line of sight to Kaivan's profile from where he sat. Kaivan hadn't moved since the cabin went quiet around him. But Zaire noticed, just barely, that the angle of Kaivan's head had shifted. He was facing the direction of Brianna and the supervisor, listening, processing whatever he could catch. And in that moment, Zaire made a quiet decision. He would not intervene loudly. He would not perform the reveal in the middle of the aisle for the cabin to watch. That wasn't the point. The point was correction, precision, getting the structure of the false accusation dismantled the same way it had been built. Quietly, methodically, without leaving room for doubt. He reached forward, picked up the tablet, opened a new document, and began writing the exact questions he intended to ask Brianna and Terrence Wole the moment the official inquiry opened. In the galley behind the forward curtain, something hit the floor. Small sound. A single sharp knock. Then nothing. And when Zaire looked toward the curtain, really looked, he noticed the cabin log showed one entry that hadn't registered before. A crew communication. Logged at exactly the time of the accusation. Sender. Row 4 call button. Recipient. Forward galley. Duration. 41 seconds. Terrence Wole had triggered the call button. Right before Brianna walked up the aisle. If you've ever watched someone stay quiet in the face of a public accusation, not because they had nothing to say, but because they already knew the truth would surface, what do you think takes more strength? Defending yourself loudly, or letting the lie expose itself? The call button log sat on the tablet screen. Zaire didn't move. 41 seconds. That's how long Terrence Wole had been on the line with the forward galley. Right before Brianna picked up her clipboard. Right before she walked up the aisle with that structured, rehearsed statement already formed in her mouth. 41 seconds is enough time to deliver an instruction. Not a conversation. An instruction. Zaire turned the tablet face down on his knee. Slow. Deliberate. The way you set something down when you need your hands free for what comes next. He stood up. Veron reached out and touched his arm. Not restraining. Questioning. Zaire looked at him. I'm not going to the aisle, he said quietly. I'm going to the supervisor. Veron held the look for a moment, then released his arm. Zaire moved forward. Not rushed. Not performing confidence. Just moving with the specific efficiency of someone who knows exactly what they're walking toward. He passed rows 16, 15, 14. Kept his eyes forward. Didn't look at Kaivan as he passed. Kaivan heard him pass. Tilted his head almost imperceptibly in Zaire's direction. Then went still again. The supervisor, her name tag read Claudette, was standing near the forward service area, clipboard now in her own hands, running a finger along whatever was printed there. She looked up when Zaire stopped in front of her. She registered his age in about 1 second. Then registered his expression. The age lost its relevance. "I need to show you something," Zaire said. Claudette studied him. "Sir, this is an active crew situation. I need you to." Row 4. Seat 4A. There's a call button log that places a 41-second galley communication from that seat immediately before the complaint was delivered. He said it evenly. No drama. Just the fact, laid flat. "I have the cabin log on this device." The forward curtain was partially open. Through it, in the premium section, the charcoal blazer of Terence Wolle was visible. He was facing forward. Still. But his left hand, resting on the armrest, had tightened slightly. The knuckles showed it. Claudette followed Zaire's eyeline, looked at row 4, looked back at Zaire. "How old are you?" she said, not dismissively, genuinely asking, trying to locate what was standing in front of her. 9, Zaire said. "But the log is the log. My age doesn't change the timestamp." Claudette looked at him for another moment. Then she turned, stepped back to the galley entrance, and made a call on the internal handset. Low voice, 2 sentences. She waited, got a response. Her jaw shifted slightly when she heard it. She hung up, turned back toward the cabin. "Stay here," she said to Zaire. She moved up the aisle toward Khyven's row, past it, continued to row 4. Terence Wolle looked up when she stopped beside him. He smiled. The practiced smile of a man who had done this before. Warm, cooperative, slightly victimized. The whole performance in one expression. Claudette did not return it. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying just enough to be audible to the rows immediately around him. "I need to review your pre-boarding documentation and your cabin communication record for this flight." The smile held for exactly 2 seconds. Then it did something it wasn't built to do. It slipped, just at the edges, just slightly. The corners didn't fall, the eyes did. The warmth pulled back from them like a tide. And what was left underneath wasn't anger. It was calculation, the kind that runs fast when a plan starts to unravel. He opened his mouth. Claudette held up one hand. Gently, professionally. "This isn't optional," she said. 3 rows away, a woman in a window seat watched. Her hand, which had been resting on her folded cardigan, slowly uncrossed. Like something that had been held tight was beginning to release. She wasn't the only one. The cabin was watching, not with the detached judgment it had carried during Khyven's confrontation. With something different now. With attention. The particular kind that comes when people begin to suspect they've been reading the wrong person as the problem. Zaire had walked back to his row. Veron was watching him as he sat back down. Neither of them spoke. Across the cabin, near row 10, Brianna stood alone. The clipboard was gone. Claudette had it. Brianna's hands were at her sides now. She wasn't moving. She was looking at the floor in front of her feet with the expression of someone who has just been shown the gap between what they thought they were doing and what they actually did. That gap is enormous when you see it clearly. And it was opening in front of her right now. Khyven hadn't moved. But his head had shifted almost imperceptibly again. Not toward the confrontation in row 4. Toward the row where Brianna stood. Like he already knew. Like he had been tracking her since the beginning, and waiting not with anger for the moment she understood. Zaire watched the front of the cabin. Claudette was still at row 4. Her posture had changed. It was no longer service-oriented. It was formal. The difference is visible if you know what you're watching. The squared shoulders. The weight shifted evenly. The face closed. Terence Wolle had stopped smiling. He was talking now. Quiet words. Reasonable tone. The measured pace of someone trying to reframe a situation that has left the frame. Claudette wasn't responding to the words. She was writing, documenting. Real power isn't loud. It's access. And right now, The access belonged to the 9-year-old in row 17 who had spent the last 40 minutes not reacting, thinking. The intercom above crackled again. Short. Deliberate. This time it wasn't crew to crew. It was the flight deck. And when Claudette turned toward the cockpit section after hearing it, she looked, for the first time in this entire sequence of events, like the person who didn't know what was about to happen next. The name came through, not loudly, not announced. It moved through the crew channels the way serious information moves, contained, direct, without spectacle. But Zaire caught the effect of it in the body language of every crew member who received it. Claudette's shoulders. The way they dropped exactly 1 degree. The male attendant near the galley entrance. The airline's legal department had flagged his name 18 months ago after the 3rd settlement. A formal notation existed in their passenger profile system. A behavioral marker that should have triggered a heightened review process if any cabin incident involved him. It had not triggered, because no one connected him to the incident, because the complaint had been filed against Kaivan. Wole's name wasn't on the complaint. Brianna's name was. Kaivan's name was. Wole sat in row 4 and watched from a clean distance while the documentation built around 2 other people. That's the geometry of it. You don't have to be visible to be the architect. Zaire looked at his father. Who does he work with? Veron had already been in contact with Darius for the last 6 minutes. He lowered his voice further. He's not solo. There's a third-party legal consulting group that has represented plaintiffs in at least 2 of the prior cases. They specialize in aviation liability. Fast intake. They don't advertise. Settlement fees? Significant. The airline absorbed both cases under confidentiality. Zaire nodded slowly. So the airline knows his name, but they can't prove prearrangement without crew documentation. Until now, Veron said. Until now. Because now there was a time-stamped call log connecting Wole's seat to the galley. Now there was crew placement data contradicting the accusation's foundational claim. Now there was pre-boarding documentation that showed Wole had anticipated and requested preferential treatment in the event of a cabin incident, a request that reads very differently once you understand what that incident was going to be. This wasn't a spontaneous false accusation. It was a case, built ahead of time, assembled in pieces, and the piece Wole had needed to make it work, the piece he couldn't generate himself, was a credible crew report. Brianna had been that piece. Zaire thought about that for a moment. She wasn't in on it. He was almost certain. She was new, she was operating under pressure, and she had received what she believed was a legitimate complaint from a passenger, relayed through crew channels in a way that felt official enough to act on. Airlines have protocols. She followed what looked like one. The problem was she never verified it. Never asked who the original passenger was. Never requested the written report she referenced. Never confirmed her own placement before claiming witness proximity. She had assumed, and someone had specifically designed the situation so that a person like Brianna, new, earnest, rule-following, would assume exactly that. That's what made it calculated. Not Brianna's failure. Her trust. Someone had weaponized her trust. Zaire looked toward row 4. Claudette was no longer standing there. She had moved to the galley entrance. The conversation with Wole had ended. Not with resolution, with suspension. He was sitting upright, hands folded, the cooperative mask back in place but slightly less convincing now that the warmth had drained from his eyes. He knew the board had shifted. He was deciding his next move. Zaire watched him. Wole's next move was going to be simplification. He would reduce his role. Claim he had simply pressed the call button for a service request. Claim the conversation with the galley was unrelated to the complaint. Claim he had no knowledge of Brianna's actions or their content. No paper trail connected him to the specific language of the report. No recording of those 41 seconds. No documentation of what was said. Just the timing. And timing on its own is circumstantial. It implies. It doesn't prove. Wole knew that. He was going to use it. Zaire turned back to his tablet. Opened the notes document. He typed, Wole will claim service request. No transcript of call. Timing only. Need crew statement on communication content. Need to establish whether Brianna received verbal instruction or written relay. He stopped. Looked up. Brianna was moving. Not toward row 4. Not toward Kaivan. She was walking toward the galley with a focused, deliberate stride that was different from everything she'd done since the accusation. The performance of procedure was gone. What was left moved differently. Heavier. Real. She pushed through the galley curtain. Zaire couldn't see what happened behind it, but 30 seconds later, Claudette followed her in, and the forward curtain stayed closed for 4 full minutes. Kaivan tilted his head slightly to the left. He was listening to the curtain. Veron looked at Zaire. She's telling them something. Zaire didn't respond immediately. Then quiet. Measured. She's telling them who actually called her. Veron let that land. He looked at row 4. Wole had not moved. But his phone, the one he'd placed face down earlier, was in his hand again. Screen angled downward. The short, precise tapping of messages being sent fast. He was reaching out to someone. Not stalling. Signaling. Which meant there was someone else on this flight, or connected to this situation from outside it, who was part of the architecture. Contact. A relay. Someone whose role in the scheme hadn't surfaced yet. Zaire's eyes moved through the cabin again. Unhurried. Methodical. Row by row. He was looking for someone who had gone too still. Someone whose attention was too carefully placed away from the drama that the rest of the cabin couldn't stop watching. He found it. Row 11. Window seat. A woman. Late 40s. Dark blazer over a cream blouse. Reading glasses on, but the book in her lap hadn't moved a single page in the last 22 minutes. She wasn't reading. She was waiting. Zaire studied her for exactly 8 seconds, then looked down at his tablet. Typed one line. Row 11. Window. Not reading. He looked up again. The galley curtain opened. Brianna stepped out. Her face was different. Not composed. Not crumbling. Something harder than both. The expression of someone who has just fully understood what they were part of, and decided what to do about it. She walked past Kaivan's row without stopping. Continued to row 4. Stopped beside Terrence Wole. And when she spoke, loud enough that the rows around her could hear, quiet enough that it wasn't a performance, she said 4 words. You called me first. Wole didn't flinch. That was the first thing Zaire noticed. No flinch. No shock. The practiced stillness of a man who had been accused of things before and had learned to absorb the first impact without reacting. He looked up at Brianna with an expression calibrated carefully between confusion and patience. I'm sorry, he said. The call. To the galley. Brianna's voice held. Barely. But it held. You called and told me a passenger in row 17 had made physical contact with the woman across the aisle. You said 2 other passengers had reported it. You said I needed to handle it immediately or the airline would be liable. Wole tilted his head. I pressed the call button to request a water refill. 41 seconds, Brianna said. For a water refill. He didn't answer that. Claudette had materialized at Brianna's shoulder. Not intervening. Present. The weight of official presence behind the account being delivered. Wole looked at Claudette. I don't know what this crew member was told or by whom. I had a brief service call. Whatever she interpreted from that. She's not interpreting, Zaire said. Everyone turned. He hadn't moved from his row. His voice had carried cleanly down the aisle without being raised. 9 years old. Dark suit. Blue tie. Completely calm. She documented it, Zaire said. When you called the galley, She wrote it in the crew communication log the same way she logs any service interaction. You gave her a passenger row number, a description of alleged contact, and the phrase, "The airline will be liable." Those are her words. Logged. Timestamped. Before she ever approached the passenger. Wole's jaw was still. Very still. The cooperative expression was in place. But something behind it had shifted. The eyes again. The same micropole he'd shown when Claudette first stopped beside him. The warmth receding. The machinery becoming visible underneath. That would be highly unusual for a service call, he said carefully. So would filing a pre-boarding comfort request that specifically anticipates a cabin incident, Zaire replied. On a route you've flown 14 times in the last 18 months. The cabin was not moving, not pretending to read, not looking at phones, not whispering to neighbors. The whole compressed social space of the aircraft had oriented itself toward this exchange the way metal orients to a magnet. Quietly, without deciding to, a man in a gray shirt 2 rows ahead of Wole had turned completely around in his seat. The woman who had moved her bag away from Kaivan's row had turned to look at Kaivan directly. For the first time, like she was trying to reconcile something, Veron was watching his son. Not Wole, not the exchange. His son. The most dangerous lies are the ones people believe they chose. Wole shifted. Slightly. The first voluntary movement since Brianna stopped beside him. He placed his hands flat on the tray table. Deliberate. Grounding. I think there's been a significant misreading of. The logs don't misread, Claudette said. Her voice cut differently from the way it had earlier. Not softer. More certain. The earlier uncertainty was gone. What had been reviewed behind that galley curtain? Brianna's written entry, the call timestamp, the placement contradiction, had removed it. Wole looked at her. That look lasted 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, the calculation behind his eyes ran fast. The remaining variables assessed. The exits measured. And when the 3 seconds ended, his expression did something that none of the passengers would have seen coming 20 minutes ago. It went quiet. Not defeated. Not apologetic. Quiet. The specific quiet of a man who has decided that silence is now the most strategic position available. He said nothing, and that nothing was the loudest thing in the cabin. Claudette spoke first. We'll be filing a full incident report with operations. You'll be asked to remain in your seat for the remainder of the flight and cooperate with airline personnel upon landing. She paused. Do you understand? Wole nodded once. A single, tight movement. Brianna turned away from him. She walked back up the aisle. Slower now. The urgency she'd carried into row 4 was spent. She moved like someone who has just said the true thing and is now carrying the weight of all the things that come after truth. She stopped at Kaivan's row. She didn't crouch, didn't kneel, just stood there at the edge of his space. I'm sorry, she said. Kaivan was already facing her direction. He'd been tracking her footsteps. He didn't speak immediately. Let the apology stand. Let it exist in the air without rushing to dispose of it. Then he said, Did you know? Brianna's face tightened. No. Then understand, Kaivan said. That being used is different from being wrong. One you chose. One was done to you. Brianna stood there for a moment, just absorbing that. Then she nodded once and moved toward the galley. Zaire watched her go. He looked at Kaivan. And Kaivan, without turning, without any visible indication he knew he was being watched, said, You've been in that seat the whole time. It wasn't a question. Yes, Zaire said. Kaivan nodded slowly. How old are you? Zaire hesitated. Then, 9. A pause. You should have spoken sooner, Kaivan said. Zaire absorbed that. I needed the log first. Kaivan was quiet for a moment. No, he said. You needed to be certain. There's a difference. He turned his face forward again. The cabin breathed. Not a literal sound. A shift. A collective release of something that had been held for the last 40+ minutes. The tension that had settled into the rows around Khyven began, slowly and imperfectly, to lift. The woman who had moved her bag reached down without looking and moved it back. 1 inch. Quietly. She didn't announce it. Didn't have to. At row 11, the window seat Zaire had been watching. The woman in the dark blazer had finally closed her book. Not to watch the resolution. To look at her phone. Typing something. Short message. The same short tap pattern Wole had used earlier. Zaire saw it. He picked up his tablet. Typed. Row 11 confirmed contact with Wole. Relay confirmed. Notify Darius. He passed the tablet to his father without a word. Veron read it. Read it again. Looked at row 11. Then dialed. The scheme wasn't 2 people. It never was. The plane landed at 4:47 p.m. Quiet. No turbulence. The way landings feel when everything else has already been the turbulence. 3 airline personnel were waiting at the gate. Not security. Operations and legal. The specific combination that means something has already been documented and the documentation is ready to move. Terrence Wole deplaned between 2 of them. He walked calmly. No scene. No argument. The woman from row 11, her name, Darius confirmed by the time they were taxiing, was Yolanda Fitch, a paralegal with the third-party legal firm, deplaned separately. Quietly. With the particular composure of someone who had already calculated what could and couldn't be proven. The airline's legal exposure on the settlement angle was a separate matter. One that would take months. But the immediate documentation, the log, the crew communication record, Brianna's written account, the pre-boarding request, had been submitted through official channels before wheels touched ground. Khyven was the last to stand from his row. No rush. He gathered himself the way he did everything, with the unhurried precision of a man who does not measure time by other people's urgency. His cane extended. He stood. Zaire was already in the aisle, waiting. Not to assist. Khyven didn't need that, and both of them understood it without discussion. Zaire was waiting the way one person waits for another when they have something left to say, and the plane cabin is finally quiet enough to say it. Khyven moved toward him. Stopped. "You're Veron Hale's son," he said. Not a question. Yes. Khyven seemed to think about that for a moment. About what it means to be the son of a man like Veron. The access. The position. The weight of a name that moves things. Then, "You didn't use your father's name until the end." Zaire considered that. The log didn't need his name. Khyven nodded slowly. Like that answer confirmed something he'd already suspected about the person standing in front of him. They moved up the aisle together. Not side by side, single file, the way aisle width requires. But close. Veron fell in behind them. He hadn't spoken much since the revelation in row 4. That wasn't unusual for him. He processed privately. It was one of his most effective professional qualities and one of his more complicated personal ones. But today the silence carried something different. Something that cost him. They reached the gate. The other passengers had mostly cleared. The operations team was already involved with Wole's situation in a side corridor. Claudette and Brianna were with a senior airline supervisor at a desk near the gate. Brianna was speaking. Still talking. Working through the full account. Good. The truth takes longer to tell than the lie. That's always how it goes. Veron stopped walking just past the jet bridge. Khyven stopped with him. They looked at each other. 2 men in the particular silence that exists between people who understand that the thing just passed was larger than the words available to describe it. "I owe you an apology," Veron said. Khyven waited. "I was going to let it go quiet," Veron said. "My first instinct was management, not truth. And that," he paused, chose the next word carefully. "That would have been wrong." Khyven was still. "I know why you do that," he said. People like you are trained to solve problems by containing them. You're not built to sit inside one and watch it work itself out. Veron absorbed that. My son, Veron said, is better at this than I am. Khyven's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The edge of one. He didn't do it for a win, Khyven said. Veron looked at Zaire, who was standing slightly apart from them, watching the gate corridor. Not listening to be polite, or listening and pretending not to. Why did you? Veron asked him. Zaire turned, looked at Khyven, then at his father. Because nobody else was going to, he said. And the longer it sat there, the more permanent it became. A pause. Long. An accusation without a challenge, Zaire continued. Doesn't stay accusation. It becomes history. Khyven said nothing, but the thing that moved across his face wasn't small. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, produced a card, held it out in Zaire's direction. Not handed, held out, angled correctly, the exact angle for a person positioned where he knew Zaire was standing. He couldn't see the gesture he was making, but he made it perfectly. Zaire took the card. Plain. Minimal. A name. A number. Nothing else. When you're older, Khyven said, and you need a reference who will not lie for you, call me. Zaire looked at the card. Looked up. Why would I need someone who won't lie for me? Khyven moved his cane forward. One step toward the corridor. Because honest references are rarer than people think, he said. And they're worth more. He moved past them. His footsteps down the corridor were even, measured. The particular rhythm of someone who walks through unfamiliar spaces not by sight but by sound and certainty. He didn't slow as the corridor bent. Didn't reach for the walls. He just moved, like he trusted where he was going. Zaire watched until the corridor swallowed him. Then he looked down at the card. Then at his father. Veron was still looking at the bend in the corridor. Dad, Zaire said. Veron turned. You chose procedure over truth, Zaire said. Not with anger, just clearly. The way you say something that matters to someone who is capable of hearing it. Veron held his son's gaze for a long moment. He didn't argue. He didn't defend. I know, he said. That was it. 2 words. But they carried the full weight of a man who had spent 20 years making the efficient choice and was only now fully measuring what the efficient choice costs when the thing at stake is someone's dignity. They walked out of the terminal together. Not everything had been resolved in that corridor. The legal process would take time. Wole's operation would require investigation. The airline's internal review of how the complaint had reached Brianna unverified would be uncomfortable for multiple people in the crew chain. Yolanda Fitch's role would have to be established through documentation. That work wasn't done. It was just beginning. But the thing that needed to be witnessed had been. And the people who needed to carry the truth of it forward were carrying it. Boy asked his father quietly, as they stepped into the open air outside the terminal. Why didn't he stop it earlier? He knew from the start. Veron thought about that. Ask him someday. I don't need to, Zaire said. He needed to see who would believe it. Veron slowed, looked at his son. And Zaire didn't answer immediately. He watched the traffic moving outside the terminal. The ordinary rush of people going places. The world that had no idea what had just happened 37,000 feet above it. Too many people did, he said. 3 weeks later, Veron Hale sat in his office on the 41st floor and read the report. 11 pages. Single-spaced. The airline's internal review of the incident. The documentation chain. The identified breakdown in complaint verification protocols. The recommendation for revised crew training on third-party passenger communication and escalation procedures. And on page 7, a single paragraph about Terrence Wole. Formal notice of permanent travel restriction across the parent carrier's full network. pending civil proceedings related to documented attempt to manufacture an actionable cabin incident for financial gain. The third-party legal group, the one Darius had flagged, under separate regulatory review. Veron set the report down, looked out the window at the city below. He thought about the moment on the plane when he'd reached for Zaire's arm. Not to stop him, to check on him, to ask without words, "Do you know what you're doing?" And Zaire had just looked at him, the way you look at someone when the answer is obvious. Veron had spent 23 years learning to manage rooms, to neutralize tension before it became visible, to find the path that moved everyone toward resolution with the least friction. It was a skill, a real one. It had built the company and protected the people in it and navigated situations that would have broken less disciplined men. But somewhere in the machinery of that skill, a gap had formed between what was efficient and what was right. He hadn't noticed it growing. He noticed it now. The office door opened. Zaire came in without knocking, which was standard. He was carrying a backpack over one shoulder and a tablet in his other hand. School day. Still in his uniform. Dark slacks, white shirt, collar open, tie loose. He looked like himself. Just a kid. Except for the eyes. The eyes were always doing something. "How's the report?" Zaire asked. He'd been briefed on it already through Darius. He just wanted to know where his father was in relation to it. "Thorough," Veron said. Zaire set his backpack down and looked at the report on the desk. Scanned the visible page. Page 7. Yes. Good. He didn't say it with satisfaction. Just confirmation. A thing that needed to happen, happening. Zaire moved to the chair across from his father's desk and sat. Veron looked at him. "You knew from the beginning," Veron said. Not accusatory. Just stating it. Zaire thought about that for a moment. Genuinely thought about it. He didn't answer fast. "Not exactly," he said. "I knew it didn't add up. That's not the same as knowing." Veron nodded. "But you were certain something was wrong before you had the log." "Yes." "What told you?" Zaire looked at the window. The city outside. He was quiet for a few seconds. "She didn't hesitate at the beginning," he said. "She hesitated in the middle, when he asked for the time." He paused. "If you actually witness something and you're reporting it, the time is the first thing you know. It's the anchor. You're scared, you're certain, the time is locked in." She gave it to him blurry. That means she received it blurry. Veron sat with that. "I should have caught that," he said. "You weren't looking," Zaire said. "You were managing. It wasn't a criticism." And his father had asked for it. They sat in the quiet of the office for a moment. The hum of the city coming up through the glass. 41 floors of ordinary life below them. Veron said, "What did Kaivan teach you?" Zaire looked at him. "He didn't teach me anything," he said. "He confirmed something." "Which was?" Zaire folded his hands across his knee. The same gesture, Veron realized, that Kaivan had used on the plane. Hands open, flat, still. "That composure isn't the same as surrender," Zaire said. "Most people think if you don't fight back immediately, you're losing." Kaivan understood something different. He understood that the truth doesn't expire. You don't have to rush it. You just have to protect the space for it to surface. Veron was quiet for a long time. "And you?" he said finally. "Why didn't you speak sooner?" Zaire looked at him. "He told me I should have." Veron's expression shifted. Something in it opened. "What did you say?" "I said I needed the log first." "And he said." Zaire was quiet for a moment. "He said I needed to be certain. And that certainty and waiting for evidence aren't the same thing." Veron looked at his son. Really looked. The 11-page report on his desk. The 41-floor view. The company he'd built. The decisions he'd made. All of it arranged around him like furniture. and his 9-year-old son sitting across from him, telling him, not unkindly, that the most important skill isn't knowing what to do when you have all the information. It's knowing what to do when the information isn't complete. And doing it anyway. He stood, walked to the window, stood beside it with his hands in his pockets and looked at the city. I chose procedure, he said. Yes. On the plane. My first move was containment. Yes. And if you hadn't been there, he would have handled it, Zaire said. Kaivan was never helpless. He was waiting. Veron turned to look at his son. For what? Zaire met his father's eyes. To see who would believe it. A long pause. The city moved below them. Traffic. People. The ordinary frictionless rush of the world. Too many did, Veron said quietly. Yes, Zaire said. But not all. He picked up his backpack. Stood. Moved toward the door. At the door frame he stopped. Didn't turn around. Dad. Yes. The worst part of that accusation wasn't that it happened. A pause. It was how fast the cabin adjusted to it. He left. Veron stood at the window for a long time after the door closed. Looking at the city. Thinking about a blind man who sat still under 37,000 feet of sky and waited. Not passively, not without cost, for the world to correct itself. And a 9-year-old who understood, before almost anyone else in that cabin, that the world only corrects itself when someone refuses to look away. The worst injustice isn't the accusation. It's how quickly people accept it. He looked at the report on his desk. Page 7. Then he picked up the phone. Not to manage something, to do something. There is a difference. And for the first time in a long time, he felt it. That story just showed you something real. A blind man who stayed calm when the entire cabin had already decided. A 9-year-old who refused to look away. And a father who had to confront the difference between managing the truth and protecting it. If this story moved you, if it made you think about a moment when you stayed silent when you should have spoken, or spoke when it would have been easier to stay quiet, share that in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Every story on this channel is built to make you think, feel, and see the world a little more clearly. Don't miss what's coming next.